Last class we looked at abstract expressionism in America. We learned of the artists and how they reacted to the end of World War II. Many of these artists were in a state of personal mending and didn't want to create art containing social issues. Art critics and the abstract expressionist artists during this time in America distanced themselves from the immediate horrors that the world experienced and lived through, including the Great American Depression. Some, like Rothko, looked inward for a spiritual solution, while others, like de Kooning, displayed an outward expression of his passions through his expressive brushstrokes. However, many European artists could not respond the same way as the artists over in America or European refugees like Mondrian and Duchamp did. Artists in Europe survived World War II and were living in its immediate aftermath. Cities such as Warsaw, Rome, and Berlin, among others, were severely damaged due to bombing. The city of Dresden was basically flattened to nothing. Tens of millions were killed. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with Roman gypsies, disabled adults and children, women who were undesired and no longer able to reproduce, and homosexual men. The Nazis may not have won the war, but they succeeded in many ways by inflicting open wounds on the earth and its people. Hitler and his regime left a legacy of hatred and fear, along with personal and physical loss, that from which we are still recovering from to this day. To make things worse, people were also struggling with the knowledge and acceptance of modern inventions from the United States, such as the atomic bombs, which fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, which killed over 500,000 civilians, either by instantly incinerating them or by radiation poisoning, which took anywhere from a couple days for some and up to several years for others. I realize that the tragedies of the wars may be exhausting for us to continually learn about this semester, but imagine the survivors who spent years living through these tragedies. So when we look at work done during these times that we don't get or like, we must remember that they were dealing and trying to understand and come to terms with their world around them. As mentioned last class, artists now question traditional themes and techniques that they associated with institutions and values that led to ultimate warfare and genocide. Artists now were no longer bound to any pre-existing rules, only that of their own actions and thoughts. We are going to talk about figurative art in France. This is an oil and charcoal on canvas by Picasso, titled The Charnel House, Paris 1944 to 1945. In 1944, Picasso joined the Communist Party. Like his Guernica painting, this is also done in grisaille. Grisaille in this painting refers to its tones of gray. Here we see in Picasso's late Cubist style a domestic setting in a home. Towards the upper part of the painting, we see an open line drawing of a tabletop, right up here, and placed on the tabletop is a pitcher along with some food. Underneath the table are the anguished remains of a massacred family. This is a horrific scene, and if we look on our left, we can see the mother, and then here on the right is the father with his hands tied very tightly at the wrist. And we know they're tied tightly because of how his hands and his fingers are spread apart and separated. His eyes are hauntingly left open, as his eyes are down here, as his baby is by his side, their baby, with its little hand over its mouth. Picasso, by not covering his underdrawing, and the underdrawing we can see over here, okay, a little bit throughout here. Okay, that's all considered an underdrawing. And what many people refer to those as is ghost marks, which gives the painting its own history, thus reflecting the messy, cruel, real history it represents. This next piece is a bronze sculpture titled Head of a Man on a Rod by Giacometti. Giacometti, who was once entrenched in surrealism, now felt that he needed to create works that reflected his actual world. Here we see a man's head tilted upward, impaled on a rod. His mouth is open, left agape, as if showing us this man's last breath. This rough textured surface is one that is recreated in many of his works during this time. It is created through his process when starting his work by manipulating wet plaster with his hands, enabling him to express damaged flesh, and at times in other sculptures it expresses objects and landscapes that are no longer pristine or perfect. As you learn more about art during this time, you will every now and then come across the term existentialism and how it relates to artwork. Existentialism is basically a philosophical theory that emphasizes the individual person who determines their own development through willful acts. Philosophies in general are not easily understood or summed up in one or two sentences, but this I think should help introduce the concept of existentialism. It can also be loosely defined as a spirit or aura of how one responds to human existence. Although Giacometti discouraged his work from being compared to existentialism, critics could not help to make a connection because each of Giacometti's figures seemed to embody their own space, often being a space of loneliness and emptiness. The main connection between Giacometti's post-war sculptures and existentialism is that they rely on individual experience rather than prior knowledge. We can see that here in this piece titled The Forest, composition with 7 figures and 1 head from 1950. The figures and heads stand independently from one another. The texture of his last piece is created again, showing deteriorated flesh. There is no interaction between these figures. Giacometti creates an isolated feeling between these figures, even though they are not alone. This sculpture is like what we've just seen, but it's made by a different artist named Germaine Richer. It is titled Hurricane Woman. Here we see a strong but wounded woman. She stands with a determined look in her eyes, but we can tell she is wounded through the slight disfigurements and textured surface, appearing almost as raw, damaged skin. Her surfaces are like that of Giacometti's. It's important to note that these two artists were creating their works at the same time during the late 1940s and into the 1950s. This piece is a painting by Baltus titled The Golden Days. Baltus came from a distinguished Polish family and grew up in Paris, Geneva, and Berlin. He came from a family of artists. His mother was a painter, as was his father, who was also an art historian. Baltus later moved to Paris, where he received no formal training, but practiced painting by copying old masters' paintings from the Louvre. This painting here is one of his most well-known pieces. Here we see a scene that can be interpreted 2 different ways. It's a provoking piece since this pubescent girl is wearing a pearl necklace, her outfit slips off her shoulder, and her posture along with the look in her eyes seem to signify a more sophisticated sexual manner. One can interpret this scene as seeing a disheveled young girl involved in a secret affair as her lover attends the fire. Or it can be interpreted as a young girl spending time at home while her father or brother attends the fire. This piece has a nostalgic quality to it. However, there is also an unnerving sense of uncertainty to this piece that cannot be denied. This next artist we are going to talk about is Jean Dubuffet. Dubuffet was inspired by and found powerful models in the art of the mentally ill. He felt that the way the mentally ill expressed themselves in their art was more valid than the art of museums or the new art that was being exhibited in galleries. In this piece called Carpe de Dame, Chateau de Tout, we see a female body that has been completely flattened as if crushed by large rollers. Here he is questioning the Western tradition of the nude and the normal standards of beauty. In this sense, he is compared to de Kooning's Woman series, although de Kooning's work plays off of traditional ways of interpreting the female form, while Dubuffet's piece here does not. This piece, where the oil is applied in a thick manner, is carved into and drawn on in a childlike manner. French abstraction during this time was like American abstract expressionism in the fact that they both moved away from geometric abstraction and moved to more spontaneous work that was driven by emotion and intuition. Art informel was a term used in French abstraction starting in 1950, meaning formless art. European gestural painting was referred to as tachisme. This piece by Bram van Velde, titled Painting, from 1955, is a nice example of gestural painting of tachisme. Van Velde was close friends with the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, who wrote about Van Velde's work. Here we see different shapes and forms loosely painted onto the canvas. The oil is applied in a thin manner as if it were watercolor, and we can see where the artist chose to allow the drips to roll down the canvas. Van Velde was unaware of the action painting happening in America at this time. However, his painting shows many similarities. Hans Hartung was a German artist who fled from the Nazis in the 1930s and moved to Paris. He met Kandinsky and explored abstract surrealism, but always kept a gestural, spontaneous quality to his works. In this piece, titled T-1954-20, we see large black slashes on top of softly blended tones of reds and browns. It was around this time that Hartung was introduced to American Expressionism, specifically the art of Franz Kline. This next image by Walz is titled Bird. Walz was a German musician and photographer, but he favored drawing and painting. He was only 19 when he moved to Paris and met Jean Arp and Giacometti. Walz lived in France without a permit and was considered an army deserter because he ignored the summons of the German labor service. This caused him to be imprisoned for 3 months in Barcelona, where he was temporarily working. When he returned to France with official permission in 1936, he had to report to the French authorities on a monthly basis. During his experience in prison, he began to develop watercolors and drawings of hybrid creatures. That eventually led him into his abstract style. In this piece, we can see where he built up the thick layers of paint in the center of the canvas. Walz had an interest in biology and anthropology, and his paintings at times seem to be as if we are looking at specimens under a microscope. Coming out of the center and circling around are quick action lines and markings in red and black. Walz died at the young age of 38 from food poisoning, but his many drawings and paintings helped to define the tachisme movement. George Mathieu was an artist from the tachisme movement who was considered a lyrical abstractionist due to the fluid movements created in his works. His painting was often squeezed onto the canvas right out of the tube or placed on the canvas in quick, wide strokes using a large brush. The title of Mathieu's painting suggests that he is a history painter. This painting by Mathieu is titled Battle of the Bovines, which was a battle that took place between 1202 to 1214. It was a medieval battle that ended the Anglo-French War. Nicolas de Staël was an artist who, beginning in the 1940s, introduced figuration into his paintings. He dealt with the concepts of nature and abstraction. He felt that a painting should be both abstract and figurative. When he used the term abstraction, he meant that the painting should contain a flat surface. When de Staël used the term figurative, he meant that there should be a representation of space, not necessarily depth. This painting, titled Aguichant, is from 1954. Here, de Staël uses a palette knife to create his abstracted landscape. The forms are simplified, creating large planes of flat color. This is a sculpture made of gilded copper on crystalline base, titled Endless Ribbon from a Ring 1 by artist Max Bill. Max Bill helped to create the concept of concrete art. Bill referred to concrete art as eliminating all naturalistic elements of painting. The color and form are the only fundamental elements. Max Bill was at the Bauhaus between 1927 to 1929 and insisted that painting and sculpture must have a mathematical basis. In concrete art, Bill strived for rationalism, clarity, and harmony. This piece that we are looking at is of an endless helix or spiral. Bill made many variations of this. He liked how these images had no beginning and no end. He saw these pieces as being in a continual state of transformation and movement. Richard Paul Luce also made math the basis of his work. We can see this in his piece titled Serial Elements Concentrated in Rhythmic Groups. Luce was also an artist that followed in the concrete theory. He used 5 colors ranging in different values and distributed them using mathematical methods. As Luce created more paintings, his works became more complicated as he expanded his values and colors. Concrete art, in contrast to art informel, advanced geometric abstraction. Now we are going to move on to the art in Italy. Unlike other parts of the world where abstraction was taking precedence, Italy had a strong realist movement. Although it wasn't high realism and there were some thinking abstractly, this piece by Giorgio Morandi is a still life from 1951. Morandi painted many figurative paintings and landscapes, but Morandi consistently chose to work with the genre of still life. Morandi was a quiet person who taught in his native town of Bologna and rarely traveled. This is a nice painting, only 8 by 19 inches. It's a quiet and meditative piece where we see the bowls and boxes placed together in a neutral ground setting. Much of the figurative work that came out of Italy during the post-war period was in sculpture. This piece is a bronze titled Large Standing Cardinal by Giacomo Manzu. Manzu is influenced by the sculpture of the Italian Renaissance. Manzu originally started doing sculptures of cardinals in 1938, although this piece is from 1954. This particular cardinal is withdrawn, and you could see that by the way he's looking down and holding his heavy robe inward with his hands. This has an air of mystery around it. The heavy robe is simplified and creates volume and weight for the piece. Manzu had many religious commissions, including this bronze door panel for St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City, Rome. Here we see a set of low-relief panels titled Death by Violence that were placed in the lower panels of the doors. These scenes depict the death of common people. The lower left panel shows a woman observing the death of a tortured man hanging upside down. There were some artists doing abstract work in Italy. One was Lucio Fontana. Fontana wanted to break down the categories of painting and sculpture. He had no desire for traditional easel painting and wanted to transcend the area of a canvas and physically enter into its surrounding space. Fontana could be seen as a conceptual artist, although the conceptualism movement didn't actually begin till around 1970. Here in this painting titled Spatial Concept, The End of God, Fontana achieved an integration of surface and depth by incising his canvases. By breaking through the picture plane, he departs from the type of painting that has been done throughout much of history. In this painting right here, titled Spatial Concept Number 2, Fontana slashed the canvas and integrates the surface with depth. He physically opens up the picture area without having to create any illusions that represent space or depth. This sculpture by Fontana, right down here, titled Nature, is a roughly textured round form that has been sliced open on one side. He is incorporating the same concepts with this piece as he did with his canvases. In the Netherlands, the same place where Mondrian was from and the De Stijl movement originated, artists after World War II felt the need to become more expressionistic. In 1948, the experimental group was formed. They soon grew into a larger international group called COBRA, which stood for Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam. Most of the images contained figures or subjects. The artists of COBRA were united in their rejection of concrete art. They instead became more gestural. One of the leaders of this group was Asger Jorn. In this painting by Jorn, titled The Enigma of Frozen Water, we see what looks to be a figure standing on the canvas. Jorn used primary colors with greens, blacks, and whites. He smeared these and dripped these onto the canvas. Jorn was fascinated with mythic subjects and Nordic folklore traditions. This next artist is difficult to categorize into any one group. Unterwasser was Jewish, lived in Nazi Germany, hiding his identity the entire time. Unterwasser did a lot of traveling and lived at times in Italy, France, and Austria. He was inspired by artists like Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele. His early work had similar traits to Paul Klee's work, and they both took an interest in artwork done by children. In this painting, titled House Which Was Born in Stockholm, Died in Paris, and Myself Mourning It, shows distinctive jewel-like colors. In the lower center part of the canvas, the artist portrays himself crying tears of red. He later went on to develop urban architecture. This piece is a marble sculpture titled Group 3 Evocation by British artist Barbara Hepworth. Hepworth was internationally well known as a sculptor before World War II. She and Henry Moore both attended Leeds School of Art at the same time and were close friends. These are slightly biomorphic and very simplified figures. Barbara Hepworth was inspired early on by ancient Egyptian Cycladic and archaic art. This is a small-scaled piece that shows her continued interest in ancient art, specifically of Cycladic prehistoric Greece. We looked at Henry Moore once before during the Surrealism lecture. Here he is again, and like Hepworth, his figures are still and calm. As a soldier in World War II, he was gassed after enlisted at the Battle of Cambrai, which deeply affected him. Moore made thousands of drawings during World War II of the underground air raid shelters in London. This was one of his drawings titled Study for Tube Shelter Perspective. In King and Queen, Henry Moore creates a piece reminiscent of ancient Egyptian sculpture, although here we see Moore's personal style of masked faces and simplified leaf-like bodies. These figures sit in a regal fashion on a bench that can be perceived as a throne. This Irish artist was entirely self-taught. When he was a teenager, he left Dublin, Ireland, traveled through Europe, and finally settled in London. His work has been described as terribly beautiful. Francis Bacon created violent and grotesque figurative imagery in his paintings. His work has been viewed as a reaction to the troubles of the world or the attitude towards life's insignificance. Most of Bacon's pre-war work does not exist. This piece is titled Painting from 1946. It is a disturbing painting. Here we see an open black umbrella, and underneath it is the lower half of a head to a mouth with a bloody red mustache. So if we look, we can see that black umbrella, and then we see this half head with an open mouth with a red, like a bloody red mustache just above it. We only see his shoulders as the rest of the monstrous man disappears. In front of him is a circular structure like Bacon's early furniture designs. So here's his shoulders that, right below his body tends to disappear. And then there's like a table, a round table. And then on it is chunks of meat. And then underneath that is a rug, okay, an oriental rug, showing that maybe this man is seated at a round table. His yellow corsage makes the viewer wonder if there is a formal event or reason for the flowers pinned to his coat. Now, behind the half-faced man is a large carcass of meat pulled apart to resemble the shape of a crucifixion. And we can see that right here, okay, right there. Bacon was inspired by artists such as Giotto, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh. Bacon started to make a series of work in 1949 after Diego Velázquez's Portrait of Pope Innocent X. Paintings from this series, such as this one titled Head 6, the figure is usually seated in a large space. Here, the figure is being pulled upward. The open mouth, right here, gives the impression of an eternal scream. Bacon's intention was to, and I quote, make the best painting of the human cry. This photograph that we see here on the right is a still from Sergei Einstein's film titled The Battle Potemkin from 1925. We can compare it to Bacon's Head 6. Here we see a close-up of a woman of Odessa who has come to show support for the sailors engaged in a mutiny against their cruel officer. Soldiers of the Imperial Army attacked the supporters, and this woman was one of the supporters who was attacked, and she was wounded in the eye as a result. This photo echoes the human cry that Bacon was aiming for in his painting. This next painting by Francis Bacon, titled Triptych, May-June 1973, again shows a scene of human suffering. Bacon made many triptychs involving this theme. This particular piece is about Bacon's companion who died of a deliberate drug overdose. On the eve of Bacon's first major retrospective, while he was busy with opening celebrations, his companion George Dyer, who was in Paris, took his life. The paintings show the pale ghost of Dyer, who can be seen through the dark doorways. The painting on the left, right over here, shows the figure sitting on a commode, leaning forward as if doing something. The center image shows him right here, feeling the effects of the drugs as the darkness spills out into the lit room. And the third painting on our right, right over here, shows Dyer reaching for the sink as if getting sick. The white arrows are meant to draw the viewers to Dyer's final moments of life, and those arrows are right here, and you can see that. Lucian Freud is the grandson of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. He was born in Berlin. In 1933, when Hitler rose to power, his family moved to England. Freud had a gift for drawing at a young age and always had an interest in figurative work. This piece, called Girl with Dog, is an exceptional painting. Here we see tight linear precision, painted in great detail. Look at the lines painted on the sofa and the detail in the folds of her yellow-green robe. And you can see that right here. And even the soft highlights and the dent of this cushion here. And there's the folds of the yellow-green robe. Unlike many artists of his time, Lucian Freud is going for representational accuracy. This accuracy is also seen in the dog and the figure. And look at the accuracy here in the dog's face. And the fingers right here, how realistic they're looking. And also especially in the foot here. Freud started early on his gray and muted tone palette. As he aged, Lucian Freud's works began to loosen. One of his favorite models was an Australian transvestite named Lee Bowery, who was a performance artist. He was a large man with a commanding presence. Here is Naked Man back view. We see Bowery's large back as he leans forward on his white stool that he sits on. His head is tilted to his left, as if he is looking at something in his hand. This is a very unclassical pose. Usually we see the model's face and the front of their body. Here we just see his large, massive back. However, the way Freud chooses to render his subjects keeps the viewer's interest. This is just as much about application of paintings as it is about Freud's representing his subjects. If we look in the upper right of this canvas, we see a paint-covered area of the wall. And the texture on the back wall matches the texture in certain areas of his body. So if we look, we can see the texture on this wall. And then he matches that texture in certain areas of the body. And that keeps the eye moving around the canvas, even down in here. Okay. Now, this back wall could be where Freud worked on some of his paintings. However, it shows us an engagement with the materiality of painting. This image is a photograph by Werner Bischoff. It was taken in Cologne in 1946. Bischoff crossed the country after the war ended and tried to capture in his works the face of human suffering. This photograph shows what the city of Cologne, Germany looked like after the bombing ended. It is desolated. The buildings are mere skeletons of what they once were. To our left, we see a lone man walking and calmly looking at all the devastation of the now abandoned, empty place. This last photograph is by Robert Duesneau. It is a photograph in 1949 Paris and is from his series called The Sideways Glance. Duesneau liked to capture amusing happenings during the most commonplace situations. Here we see a couple standing at a storefront window. The woman looks at the painting in front of them. We see the man discreetly looking over to the painting of a beautiful young nude hanging on the wall on the side here. So if we look, here's the woman and she's looking at the painting, and he is discreetly glancing over at this beautiful female nude. Now the woman is oblivious to her man's interest in the nude female. This is a more light-hearted look at life in the post-war era. Other artists also turned to the comic and the absurd. It soon became a movement known as Nouveau Realism.